Galesburg man who dedicated most of his life to a career in law enforcement is ready to share his story in the form of a book. David Clague retired as Knox County Sheriff in 2022, ending a 16-year run in the position and nearly 50-year career in law enforcement. Prior to his time as sheriff, Dave worked 34 years with the Galesburg Police Department, retiring as a lieutenant in 2007. From crime stories to fatal accidents, from arrests to apprehensions, to weather disasters, to emergency situations, Dave has seen it all during almost a half a century wearing a badge. Quite a long time, right?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Dave is collaborating with former Galesburg journalist and author Steve Elliott on a proposed book that's sure to provide a fascinating look inside the world of law enforcement. Dave and Steve, thank you for joining me on Galesburg In Focus.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jay.
So if the name Steve Elliott sounds a little familiar, he's a former colleague of mine at the Register-Mail, where he was the police and courts reporter from 1992 to 2000. So, Steve, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you, Jay.
Good. So let's dig into it. How did the idea of a book come up? Steve, I think you maybe pitched the idea to Dave.
Yeah, Dave and I have had a relationship, I guess you would say, since I was a police and courts reporter back in 92, and I've always kept in touch with him on occasion. And I presented something to him last year. I believe it was just on a Facebook message. I said, hey, Dave, would you ever be interested in doing a book on your career now that you're retired and kind of looking at your career? And he agreed to that, and I said, let's just see what happens, see where the journey takes us.
What kind of prompted you? I mean, you covered a lot of people during your career. Why did you think Dave would make a good subject?
Well, I've covered a lot. I was in journalism. I started my first journalism job in 1989, retired from the newspaper industry in 2017 with the Rock Island Argus Moline Dispatch up in the Quad Cities. And I've always covered police and courts to some degree, and I thought it was something that's always fascinated me, and it's something that's always captured my interest, whether it was in Galesburg going to the public safety building every morning to get police reports, looking through them, and then in the afternoon going to the courthouse covering first appearances and prelims and jury and bench trials. But Dave was a detective at Galesburg PD, and I would see him there on occasion, and then there were cases, obviously, that he was involved with investigating, and I would talk to him sometimes about those cases, dot my I's, cross my T's kind of stuff, you know, so make sure it's correct. But I always had a good rapport with him, and we were able to, I guess, just kind of keep that relationship, and I thought he would be an interesting person to talk to since he's kind of done both. You don't see a lot of that, right, where he was a lieutenant and he's been with the police department since 74, seen all these changes, and then after he retires, he's sheriff.
Yeah.
And I thought there's, two worlds there, common, but then some similarities and some not similarities. So I thought it would be an interesting book on him and his career in law enforcement.
Okay. How about you, Dave? What was your reaction when Steve approached you? Had you ever thought about a book before?
I had never thought about it, but I think my first response to Steve was, it's going to be a very short book. I had never thought about it, but after we discussed, it intrigues me as well.
Mm-hmm. Any apprehension about doing a book, or?
I don't think so. Steve had sent out an email on Facebook here a couple of months back just to see what type of a response he would receive in regards to writing the book. Mm-hmm. And he notified me, and I checked on my Facebook, and I think there's over 80-some responses in about a 5-minute lag time.
Okay.
So that kind of boosts the ego a little bit that, hey, maybe we are on the right track.
Okay. How about Steve? How are you approaching the book? What's the process like as far as interviewing Dave, and what's the format of the book going to be?
Well, a lot of it, I think, is probably going to be some of our journalism background, using that, doing a lot of interviews, conducting interviews, doing research. I've interviewed Dave now 5 or 6 times, I'm guessing, since last fall. Retired Chief John Schloff, crime scene investigator, retired with the state police, Tom Murchie. There's a few more people I'd like to interview, but the process is just, acquiring the information, getting your notes, getting your cases and some of the subjects you want to do, and then going forward with that on a draft and working through that. And that's what I'm doing right now is, working through a first draft, which is going to be the main draft. And it's basically a biography on Dave, with him telling his story, and then with others contributing to that, saying how they worked with him and some of the things they did with him, and they can share some of the topics that we're looking at when it comes to law enforcement.
Okay. Obviously, you've written a lot of stories, during journalism. How is it different than writing a book? Have you written books before?
No.
Okay.
I did write a 70,000 word police procedural that is still sitting in my closet, and it's a rough draft, first draft, and it's something I'd always like to get back to someday, hopefully sooner than later. But with this project, I have a full-time job now, and I enjoy my job. I like it with the American Rental Association. I write there. I'm a news and products editor for their magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And what I do with that job, I think that also keeps me fresh, too, because I'm writing still, and it keeps me keeping up with new ideas and trends and such. But getting back to the book with Dave, I wanted to do that as kind of a bucket list thing, and I just thought Dave would be a good, great person to interview to do something like this. And so far, I think it's working out pretty good.
Okay. This is Jay Redfern. I'm talking to former Knox County Sheriff David Clague and former Galesburg journalist Steve Elliott. They're collaborating on a book about Dave's career. So, Dave, what's the process been like for you? How much of your career is kind of top of mind, and how much is it kind of hard to think back?
It does become difficult thinking back to 1974. But there are highlights, I guess, in my career, if you want to call it that. And those are quick to come forward. I mean, as recently as the unfortunate death of Nicholas Wiest, who was one of my deputies. So there's a lot of discussion that Steve and I have had regarding to the information, and he's done a lot of research here in Galesburg on the weekends, and I'm still digging around trying to find some of the few reports that I kept. But it's going to work out, and it is difficult sometimes. It's not as easy as what we all tend to think it is on TV when you see somebody, let's go out and kick the door in, and boom, they're arrested or shot, and you never see them do a report.
Yeah. And
that is probably, and typically I'll say that the public expects that this boom, boom, and it's over and done with.
Right.
And I mean, investigations go on for years in some cases. And it's hard to sit down with, say, a victim's family and say, this is what we're doing. And then they get inquiring and wanting to know, well, it's been a day now. How come you haven't solved the case?
Yeah.
So I hope that a lot of that will be portrayed within the book, and those people that read it would understand. I think that it's just not as simple as getting in a squad car and go out and making an arrest and being done with it.
Right. Steve, you sort of mentioned that you've been interviewing some other people. You mentioned a few names, but what's that process been like, and what kind of things are you trying to find out?
What I'm trying to find out, I guess, is just the people that work with Dave, whether it be on cases or just worked alongside him and maybe had given him advice or helped him along. And, with Chief Schloff, we met. It was probably 3 or 4 weeks ago, maybe a little longer, but we had discussed, working together and how their offices were close by and how they would talk to each other and help each other through certain cases or needing some direction with the state police and the crime scene investigator. It's more or less on the investigations on some of them, what type of methodology did you take to get to where you were with a crime, what type of things, just like what Dave mentioned about things you see on TV might not necessarily be a realistic approach to what sometimes happens in an investigation. So you kind of get some of the nitty gritty and the details of, how they proceed with a case, where it's not just all action and adventure. It's a lot of, grinding and working. And so I think that's what I'm doing, is trying to get a feel for the job and what they did, and also how it's kind of evolved over the years. with technology, and also just with maybe the environment in general, how perception sometimes is not necessarily reality, and how police are able to work in certain areas, and how that changes for them and some of their challenges.
How do you think you'll weave this together? How this story together? Will it just be like starting at the beginning of Dave's career, or will it be like, here's a story about this, here's a like an incident? How do you think you'll have you decided yet how you're going to kind of weave it together?
I mean, I have a rough idea from what I've written. It's just basically his start in Galesburg, growing up, his interest in law enforcement, how that came about when he started with the police department in 1974, and then how he kind of moved through the ranks. And I think you had said since 1982 you've been involved in a homicide every year, investigating perhaps, and some years more. I think 8 you had one year. So I think maybe focusing on some of the cases involved with that, and then just kind of looking at how his career kind of went through the motions, as well as I guess in general how that went from Galesburg PD to Knox County Sheriff, and then some of the things that occurred there.
Okay. So for each of you, before the process even started, is there like one story or recollection that both of you, you really need to find this out, something that Dave did, or Dave, just in the top of your mind, I have to tell this story? Is there just like one that just like instantly popped to the top of your head?
Well, I've already told Steve about this story, but I would have been working third shift. It would had to have been 1975, maybe 76. Henderson Street and Main Street gas stations were being robbed nightly. So then Chief Frakes would have somebody be assigned to cover Main Street and another deputy cover Henderson Street. And sure as shooting, I drove by Star Gas Station, which is no longer there at Academy and Main, and I looked and I thought, that guy's getting out of the car with a gun. So I turned around, and as I'm getting ready to go into the parking lot, he sees me, jumps in his car. Well, the chase is on. And he was driving a Chevelle Super Sport, and I got a police car. So we went out west on 34 towards Monmouth, old 34 towards Monmouth. At the intersection of Lindenwood and Main Street, there was a roadblock set up. And a shot was fired, which I did not know that at the time, but it blew the spotlight off of my car, off the squad car. That, I found out later, came from one of the Galesburg officers who had not led the bad guy far enough to fire the gun. So out towards Colebrook Church, the guy's engines blew. Oil is just covered the windshield, and never turn your windshield wipers on because it just smears it.
Yeah.
He ends up probably 50, 60 yards out in a cornfield. It was fall. The corn was still up, and it was just me at that moment. Went out and approached the car, and there was nobody in it, so obviously he was out in the cornfield somewhere. Large cornfield, and by then the state, the city, everybody was getting there. We ended up utilizing the canine from Peoria PD, and the dog and handler was there within 40 minutes. Nothing. So there was a sergeant and a lieutenant at the scene, and everybody's leaving. And I'm thinking, I'm not going to leave because my car was down the road a little ways. And so I got a little bit closer to where he entered the cornfield, and by then it was just me. And I laid down in the ditch. And pretty soon you could hear the shuffling through the corn stalks, and then it stopped. Eventually he came out. Eventually I apprehended him, cuffed him, put him in the squad car. I'm the proud peacock at that moment. I'm a new guy on the shift, and I get back to the old police station here on South Cherry Street, and sergeant's waiting in the alleyway, congratulates me, pats me on the back. And he says, the lieutenant would like to speak with you. Well, he's going to say, great job.
Award, huh?
Yeah. Walked in there, and he says, please shut the door. And I thought, oh, this isn't going to be a friendly one. Well, I negated to put my hat on when I got out of the car. and he recognized that when he was there at the scene. So I got written up because I wasn't wearing my hat.
Details, huh? Yeah. That's funny. How about you, Steve? Did you know, or did you have anything in mind right off the bat? This story just has to be told, like one specific incident or anything?
I don't know if it was a specific incident, but maybe, I don't know, Dave, if you remember this, but it was back in the mid-'90s. Did a ride-along with you, and I think it was you were serving a warrant, I believe, on a place in Galesburg, and you guys served the warrant, and I just remember you interviewing. I believe it was like a drug-related case, and I think maybe that's subliminally in the back of my mind thinking, there's probably some stories here, you know.
Yeah.
Some.
So you knew way back.
I knew way back. I mean, I'm not an expert by any means,
Yeah.
but I just thought, you know, it would be interesting to see the line of work and the detail involved, and you know, some of the cases that he could share, and then just, you know, the life of, you know, being a police officer, sheriff's deputy, sheriff, you know, how that kind of share it with the public.
Okay. So, Dave, I think you were involved in an investigation, kind of a famous, well-known, much talked about incident back in the 80s, which saw a local doctor accused of killing his wife in kind of a unique manner. Is this story going to be in the book, or Steve
Yes.
shaking his head yes? So.
Yes.
It was, you know, typically it always seems like when you go out thinking that you're going to come up with something, you don't. And it was one of those cases where it was, you don't. And we ended up going back, we being just about the entire detective division and a lieutenant and a sergeant, went back to the residence with a search warrant. And as I walked in, there was a pair of tennis shoes laying by the door, and it appeared to be blood. So, you know, of course, then you're focused on that as opposed to everything else. It was not blood, and it had nothing to do with the case. So we ended up down in the basement. Part of the floor was dirt, very, very hard dirt. And we started digging, and one of the detectives, the lieutenant, was saying, you know, we're wasting our time. And about that time, you could just hear a thud. I mean, it was a different sound. And it was the pelvic of a female. So that got us going, and we recovered many other parts and determined that it would have been the suspect's wife. So he was currently employed at a business. I was assigned to go get him. Went and got him, and very cordial. Put him in the car, handcuffed. And I remember getting off the elevator, uncuffing him, putting him in the holding cell. And I just said, before I closed the door, you know, I understand what you're going through. Divorce is always nasty. Mm-hmm. And that was just a guess. And he kind of smiled at me, and I closed the door and went in, did something, and came back and got him. He confessed. And from that moment on, every day in court, when I arrived and sat beside then State's Attorney Ray Kimball, he would always say, and yell loud enough for everybody could hear, "Good morning, David." So even after he was found guilty and sentenced to prison, he sent me Christmas cards.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. That's interesting. That's one of the big ones. People still talk about that case. So did you always know that you wanted to be a police officer? And how did you get involved in law enforcement?
I was at a very young age, 10 years old, and where we lived, there was a city police officer that lived 3 houses north. Every day, he was a motorcycle cop, and he rode the 3-wheel Harley Davidson with the gear shift on the gas tank. Mm-hmm. And I'd sit out there waiting for him to show up. And he'd pull in the drive sometimes, park in the street sometimes, and I would walk up there and just sit in the curb and just stare at that motorcycle. I mean, I was hooked right then and there. So I kept that thought in my head, graduated from high school, and a friend of a friend, he said to me, if you're interested in law enforcement, why don't you go and take an internship class at Carl Sandburg Jr.? And I said, yeah. So I did. I would have been 18, probably going on 19 then, and got in the internship program, rode with the county for a couple of months, and then ended up with the city of Galesburg. And again, me working full-time, I was riding on the third shift, and I knew then that I was hooked. And so the internship expired, and I went to the chief and asked permission to ride some more, and he said, absolutely. And prior to April, the test came up, and I took the test. There was 124 applicants, and myself and the other guy were tied for first and got the job.
Okay. What was it like to be a police officer 50 years ago? I know there's been lots of changes, but I mean, just what's a typical day like 50 years ago as a police officer?
Much quieter. Back then, it was all too easy to get in a fight. But very seldom was there ever a knife. Very seldom was there ever a gun. It was just a fisticuff. You get there and they're done fighting or still fighting, take them to jail. And nowadays, you don't go anywhere that you don't automatically believe that there's a gun.
A weapon, yeah. I mean, what were some of the crimes that you guys did respond to back then? What were the most frequent?
The most frequent was burglaries and armed robberies. And it wasn't an easy task by any means, because back then there was still a lot of animosity between the public and police. To get information, it was difficult to get. But that was, I would say, probably, besides domestics, those two or those three were the top priority. Another thing that was rather unique during that time frame, the beginning of the shift, you were assigned your district or your zone. And the sergeant and the lieutenant of that shift gave you a piece of paper. And you had to make so many contacts unrelated to being on a call. You had to write down their names, the time and the date, and where it was at. Now, I'll follow up to today. I think that's a great idea. Now, back then, I did not understand the reason, but I sure do now.
Yeah. Technology-wise, I mean, lots has changed since the 70s. Is there one thing or a couple things that technology-wise that has helped law enforcement more than anything? What's been the biggest, improvement to law enforcement?
I think the biggest thing right now is the crime scene tech, the availability of a crime scene tech. And we were blessed to having one of the best crime scene techs. It's all too often that the criminals are they are mobile to the point where they might do something in Galesburg or Knox County, but Henderson County may have had a burglary 2 days beforehand. And that crime scene tech can put it together to where now you're looking at a suspect who's mobile, might have shoe wear, might have a shoe print that you can come up with. Mm-hmm. But a crime scene tech is very, very important. And I don't think they're utilized as often as they should be. I know when I was with Galesburg and we had the crime scene tech, he was within our own office. So there was easy communication between all of us and that crime scene tech. And he covered a very large area, and it was amazing how many cases, the information that he would come back with would clear cases, not only for that location, but for Galesburg.
Okay. I kind of flashback, and Steve probably watched Adam 12 back in the 70s, and it was so kind of primitive what they had in their car. They had a weapon and a radio basically, and that's about it. I mean, it's come
when I first got on with the city, especially during holiday season, you were assigned a beat, and that was third shift or sometimes a second shift. The only means of communication was a key that you went to a box on Main Street, opened up, and it ran into, and that was shortly thereafter it went to the portable radios.
Okay. Yeah. So you spent 34 years with the Galesburg Police Department. Are you disappointed that you didn't get the opportunity to be police chief?
That's a loaded question. I think at the time, every person that applied for the chief's position was qualified. And it bared down to strictly the city manager making the appointment. Was I looking forward to it? You know, I was waiting to see who was going to get it. Was I disappointed? Yeah, somewhat. Mm-hmm. I think that everything went well anyway, but I would have liked to have tried.
Yeah. What's the role of being a county sheriff? You know, especially in Knox County, but how is being a sheriff different than being a police chief, say?
Well, with the police chief, and both chiefs that I worked for, Frakes and Schloff, there's politics involved. But they somehow managed to keep that away from everybody in the department. Whereas with the sheriff, there's a lot of politics involved, a lot. You know, it's one of those things where, try to figure out how to phrase it, but people that sit, whether it's on a county board or the city council, think that they know, hey, I've got an in because that's the chief or the sheriff. But the rule of thumb that I've always, if somebody's done something and you can prove it, put them in jail. And that's the way it should be. And let the state's attorney handle the case, and that way there's no dirt on the sheriff or on the chief. It's unfortunate that it comes, you know, I can recall about 2 a.m. in the morning getting a phone call from a county board chair, or not chair, but a county board member. And it was a snowstorm. Everything had been shut down for miles. And she was saying, well, my husband is stranded. Can you go get him? I'm thinking, well, where's he at? West of Monmouth. I said, well, there's no way I've got means to get there, and Warren County shut everything down. Well, he's going into diabetic shock. And I said, well, he's driving a candy truck, isn't he? Yes. I said, tell him to get a piece of candy and eat it. That'll, and he did. But that just shows you that they feel that they can jump over this person and that person to get something accomplished.
This is Jay Redfern. I'm talking to former Knox County Sheriff David Clague and former Galesburg journalist Steve Elliott. They're collaborating on a book about Dave's career. So I know many occupations lead people to taking their jobs home with them, but I can only imagine how difficult it is to be, you know, separate your personal life from being in law enforcement, especially as sheriff. How much would you say you were kind of married to the job? Were you 24/7?
I'd say 24/7, married to it 99.9. And that goes from the first day on.
Yeah.
And it's hard today not to pick that phone up and say, but you know, you can't. It's not your business any longer.
Yeah. But I assume that's just kind of part of the job, and it's in your blood, I guess, maybe you're not a good officer if you're not that invested.
I think I know for me, and I'll speak on a lot of people that have retired, it's always in your blood.
Yeah.
You know, you see the world in a different light than what most people see.
You kind of referred to this earlier, but, you know, I know you had some really difficult days on the job, but I'd have to imagine one of the toughest came in your final year when you lost one of your deputies in the line of duty. Can you kind of tell us about that day, the days following the death of Nicholas Wiest?
Actually, I was taking the day off that day, and I get a phone call first from a citizen who was inquiring as to what was going on. There was a high-speed chase on Henderson Street. So I made a phone call and found out that what had transpired at one of the local gas stations, and the guy displayed a gun, and that Galesburg was pursuing, and shortly behind Galesburg was Knox County Sheriff's deputy car. So hurriedly get up, go on into the office. You hear that call that officer down. And I will say that this officer, Deputy Nicholas Wiest, was highly respected among his peers. Mm-hmm. He was a great family man, and he was a good guy, period. when you're working in the county area, due to not having that many deputies available, and you're on the north end of the county, and you're in a situation where you know you're going to end up fighting, but your closest backup is 40 minutes away, you got to learn how to talk.
Yeah.
And Nick could talk. So after realizing that he was deceased, I am a firm believer and always have been. One of the hardest things a law enforcement officer can do is make a death notification.
Mm-hmm.
And 9 times out of 10, it's always the mother, the wife that comes to the door. And, they are not willing to embrace you. You're not willing to embrace them. So this time I took my wife and Reverend Bo Cox. We had an address. He lived in Viola. And we got about halfway there when I get a phone call, and it is relation to Nick, who is an investigator for Henry County, inquiring as to what was going on. And I didn't want to tell him until I spoke to the widow. And I said, where would she be working at? Well, she's working at this business in the Quad Cities. Well, instead of going to the house, now we're going to turn around and go back. Well, unfortunately, she started calling. Called the sheriff's department a couple of times, called dispatch, wanting to know what was going on. She and Nick had some type of code, I'm on my way home or whatever it might have been. And she had not received that code, nor could she get an answer on the cell phone. So get back, I find that out. So dispatch, I think, said to me that the phone that came from Viola. So the wife and I got back in the car, proceeded up there, and you can't beat around the bush. You've got to be very direct to the point. Told her, and she just broke down. But she goes to my wife, Debbie. They embraced for quite some time, and I'm thankful for Debbie being there.
Right.
And then I think a grandparent showed up, and that's when I thought it was time, let her. So from there, which is very common in a situation like this where the family doesn't believe it's him, their husband, brother, whatever. I had returned back to the scene, and the body was being taken. And I went to Peoria, forensic pathologist. And again, the family was in contact, and they wanted to see the body. Pretty much pleaded with them. Well, back up, because they're done with the autopsy in Peoria. They're en route back. Mark Thomas of Watson Funeral agreed to have the funeral home open that evening. And so the body's delivered. I'm back there looking at the body for quite some time. Family shows up, must have been about 11 p.m., 10:30, 11 p.m. And they're adamant they want to see the body. And Nick was the father of 2 children, boy and girl. The kids are with the spouse. She had, in-laws, parents with them. Mark Thomas did a superb job on getting him cleaned up, presentable, and they viewed the body. And for a period of time, I didn't think the kids were going to be able. I thought Mom understood that it was probably not a good idea.
Yeah.
Well, at the location where the body was at, was one of the viewing rooms. It was agreed upon by the family that one at a time would go in to see and come back out. Well, the wife had been in there. Jessica Wiest had been in there a couple of times, and she came back out, was conversing with a family member when the kids walked in and they saw Dad. And that's tough. And then it extremely time consuming. It just seemed like time just drug. I reached out to a good friend, sheriff in Vermilion County, Pat Hartshorn, knowing that he had gone through a similar experience. And I said, Pat, how do you ever get this out of your head? And pretty much quote, Dave, you never will.
Yeah.
He said, I've gone through 3 deaths of deputies. You go to bed at night thinking about it, you wake up in the morning thinking about it, and you think about it during the day. He's 100% correct. The family showed up for the hearing, murder trial, last week. And thankfully, the verdict came back guilty on all counts of murder. Now, I think it's scheduled for a sentencing hearing May 24th, but he's eligible for no parole, as he should not be allowed for
Right.
parole. But it's just been drug out, as is in 90% of the murder cases. State's attorney in Henry County did an excellent job, a superb job. She had done her homework. And there was a good turnout of Galesburg police officers, dispatchers, and Knox County Sheriff's Department. So early on that same day, I'm backtracking all the time, but back in my day, you were told to suck it up and get going.
Yeah.
Nowadays, you can't do that. And reached out to the Fraternal Order of Police, which is a union, which represents our department. They provided, I think, 4 specialists, criminal, mental health, just to sit down and talk to somebody to air it. And Bridgeway supplied 6, I think, that was round the clock with them. And then I'd received a phone call from Galesburg Fire Chief explaining MABUS. Don't ask me what the initials stand for. He says, Dave, MABUS provides a pretty good group of people to come down, sit down and talk to your people. He says, but they're all police. In the event it was fire, it would be all fire. Mm-hmm. So he says, I don't know that much about it, but one of my guys represents us with MABUS up in the Quad Cities. I'll have him give you a call. Well, I think we all know in this room that police and fire just don't mix sometimes. And I had a deaf ear. The captain called me about it, and he says, I'll get in touch with the guy that's in charge of MABUS up, I think it was Moline or East Moline Fire. I'll have him give you a call. Sure enough, he called. And once he told me that not only would there be police officers there, he would send 3 dispatchers, because the dispatchers, they're the first ones to receive that call.
Right.
And they went above and beyond the duty that day for Galesburg and for us. They were taking it extremely hard. So he reached out to the person that he reaches out to that owns a group up in the Quad Cities, and they were here within an hour and a half. And that was probably one of the more beneficial things that I ever did. Mm-hmm. Because when they came in, there was 4 or 5 of them, and I said, I want to speak to them. You come in with me, and I just want them to hear what I have to say.
Yeah.
And it worked. I'm not looking for accolades, but there were many that came out of that, including Galesburg officers, that thanked me immensely. And they were willing to come back down at any time. I think a couple of them did come back down about 2 weeks later, because they said typically the first time you talk to them, give them 2 weeks, and a lot of things can happen.
Yeah.
So I think a couple of them did come back down. But that was probably one of the tougher days I've ever had.
Sure, yeah.
And it was that way from April 22nd until, I'll say November, every day.
Okay, yeah, that's a tragic story. So I appreciate you sharing that with us. So finally, what's it like not to be in law enforcement now? I mean, life is different. I mean, do you ever stop being a cop?
I don't think you ever stop being a cop. I find myself criticizing more than anything. You don't stop being a cop. I miss the job tremendously, and I miss the people. I don't miss the politics. I just think that once a cop, always a cop, because technically we're a servant. And whether you've got 20 years on and retired or whether you have 50 on, you are a servant. And that carries over into your day-to-day normal life. With the wife having bought a business here in Galesburg, and I found myself quickly wanting to, Dave, bite your tongue, wait, don't. So, it's helped me immensely, but I miss it.
Okay, that wraps up my conversation with former Knox County Sheriff David Clague and former Galesburg journalist Steve Elliott. To both of you, I've always admired your what you do and your careers, and I can't wait to read this book. So, Dave and Steve, I appreciate you joining me on Galesburg In Focus.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jay.